Hello, I'm Betty Swann, and welcome to our show, Wisdom in the Night, where you get help for the tough decisions in your life. Tonight I have a great guest. She's a wound care specialist. Welcome, Dr. Jaymi Cheng. Thank you so much for being on this show. I can't wait to hear your story. You're young. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Such an honor to be here, Miss Betty. First off, I'm Filipino, born and raised in Manila, Philippines. Grew up typical childhood. Both my parents are professionals. They typical Asian parents. They always told us to do well in school, try to behave, and get high-paying professional jobs.
So how long did you live in the Philippines?
I basically lived there for from birth to around 25 when I moved here for residency.
Oh,
so
okay.
I matriculated in the Philippines, did my undergraduate and medical school in the Philippines. After graduating from medical school, I came to the U.S. to take the medical board exams, and then when I got accepted, I moved here to do my residency training.
So was it hard to take the medical board exam here when you'd gone to medical school in another country?
There were a lot of challenges. The tests itself, at that time, they had technology, so you're able to take the exam itself in the Philippines and then come here for interviews. But it is challenging to get residency spots, particularly because they do favor American graduates. Part of that is not necessarily racist or anything like that. They do. They try to prioritize American graduates because they're familiar with the educational system here.
Right. Where did you do your residency?
I did my residency in the Bronx at Montefiore Medical Center.
Yeah. How'd you like that?
It was fun. There was part of me that was very excited when I came to the U.S. to start my residency. It's in the field of surgery, so it was very competitive. At that time, when I got my spot, it was contingent on my performance, so I had to outperform my peers to get renewed for another year. Yeah, there were definitely a lot of challenges with that.
A lot of competition.
Right, a lot of competition. Just a little bit of my background. I grew up Catholic, didn't really have a relationship with the Lord, just went to Mass every week with my parents. It was more like a family thing. And on my second year of medical school, I happened upon a youth service near my medical school. I've heard the gospel preached, but this was the time where the idea of grace and me needing grace and not being able to justify myself sort of made sense at that point. So that's when I started having a personal relationship with Jesus. Around medical school and through medical school, my walk was relatively easy. There was a lot of grace in that part where I was surrounded with mentors, teachers, good friends, good Christian friends that helped me just have like a solid foundation in my Christian walk. But then when I came here to New York for my residency, I suddenly did not have that support system. I had church because we had a sister church from my sister church in the Philippines here in New York. But because of the demands of residency, I barely got to go to Sunday services, and I never really had relationships that helped me in my walk at that time. So I felt like that was sort of like my desert in my walk. And a lot of the things that were planted in me were challenged, mainly in the workplace. Things that I knew to be wrong were suddenly being challenged just because you needed to survive for that day.
And the competition that
right.
we're talking about too, and
right.
the fact that you want to be able to do a residency again the second year.
Right.
So there's pressure. What would you say to somebody that's watching this that says, I'm going through that very same thing right now? How did you get through that?
I definitely, the first time I was going through that, I did not do well. I succumbed to the pressure just because I felt like growing up I was sheltered. It's just the way my parents thought the best way to bring me up. School really came easy for me. I wasn't challenged that much. But when I came to the U.S., I suddenly turned from like being extraordinary in where I came from to being just one of the people trying to.
That is New York City,
yes,
isn't
it? Yes. So
everybody seems like everybody is special here, and they come here because they want to see how high can they go.
Right. And then you're suddenly faced with a reality that you are really somewhat ordinary and you have to put in, 10 times more effort and not necessarily get the same affirmation and acclaim from people as you used to have. So that was very challenging for me. I think it really, every insecurity in me kind of rose up.
I bet.
And because my faith wasn't challenged, all the stuff that I knew to be true that the Bible says is true were also challenged. And because the roots weren't dug in deep, I started compromising a lot, especially during residency. I did well for the first 2 years of residency, and then everything sort of like changed when I was promised a position, and then it was basically yanked away from me at the last moment, and that was sort of like the hay that broke the camel's back.
Really?
At that point, right? And I didn't question God's reality, like God existing at that point, but I did question whether God really looked at me as a child, as his daughter. Like I felt like at that point, I felt like every other Christian was having a good life, and I felt like the forgotten daughter.
Yeah, Jaymi, that's pretty common. A lot of people go through that, and I'll bet you anything there's somebody watching it right now that is saying that. I do feel that way. So what would you say to someone who feels like God seems to love everybody but me, and he doesn't seem to be helping me?
I would say to that person that it's an outright lie.
Really?
Yes. God loves you. God doesn't care about my performance. I wish I knew this when I was going through it, that God accepts me for who I am, not based on what I can do for him or not, and that whatever you're going through, it's not a reflection of God's pleasure or displeasure in you. Meaning, if you're going through trials, that doesn't mean that God is displeased with you or that you did something wrong. I wish I knew early on about Jesus promising that there are trials. I would tell them to hold on to that promise, that because Jesus has overcome, that they will overcome, that God will see them through it.
And so did you?
Yes, eventually. I think I had to really land rock bottom. I was sort of, I was in a surgical path. I got redirected into doing a training program as a burn fellow, which I thought at the time was not necessary, but I needed to stay here to see if I can go back. And then basically, I maxed out my visa, so I had a choice of whether I could stay in New York, and not be employed and wait to see if there was some way to sort of legally, like, have status back, mm-hmm. or go back to the Philippines. At that time, the choice was very difficult because that meant that I had to acknowledge that I failed mm-hmm. in getting my residency here. All of my friends at that time was already here in New York, so going back to the Philippines meant leaving friends. My parents were still there, but there was an added insult to the injury that I'm, as a doctor, going back to the Philippines to stay at my parents' house because I'm going back unemployed.
Oh my goodness. So what'd you do? What happened?
I prayed and asked God for direction, and at that point, the only piece that I could get was really going back to the Philippines. So the night I finally booked, this is about, say, 6 months of just hemming and hawing about what to do. The night I booked my ticket back to the Philippines, I had the best night's sleep in months, I would say. So that was an assurance that at least I was on the right path. When I was in the Philippines, I felt like I've done the worst thing in the world. Again, I didn't have like a squeaky clean walk that I can come back to God and say, Lord, I did this. Why is this happening to me? So I knew that I had some responsibility in my situation, but I felt like as I was going through it, the whole time in the Philippines, God was just assuring me that He was still there, that He was in control.
Now, and how did He do that? Because a lot of people watching this show are saying, how did He assure you? How do you know it was God?
I had, back in the Philippines, I had very long sleepless nights where I was just weeping. And I just felt like that God's tangible presence in that moment. There's no sort of like physical or logical way to explain it, but I knew in the back of my head I was going to come back to America. How, I didn't know. And I just had peace. Again, my situation did not say it. I was back home living at my parents' house. Unemployed, I wanted to call it a sabbatical. But yeah, it was pretty depressing, especially for a doctor that supposedly had like high hopes. And it was
very intelligent. It wasn't and hard worker, right?
Yeah, so yeah.
Well, now I want to ask another question, and all of that is you're saying that about the Lord kind of impressing you or telling you, I've got you here. I'm the one that brought you here. How? I know there's people also watching this show that are saying you're a rational physician. How do you take being a rational person that has to live by your mind and make major decisions with your mind, and how do you, as that person, also know there is a God and you can't see Him, but He's real?
There's a lot of ways to answer that question. I'm one of those people who think that science and God they're totally compatible. They're not incompatible with each other. You can read Old Testament passages about advanced medical theories that should not exist at the time that they were written, but they had sophisticated, knowledge about infections, how to control it, all of those things. So as a doctor, logically, I remember reading through, the first five books of the Old Testament and saying, how can anyone not believe in God when, they describe things that, they didn't know about bugs or bacteria back then, and for some reason they knew how to quarantine people. But also, in my experience as a doctor, I've also seen things that I cannot explain. I've had patients who've had stage 4 cancer. My logical mind is telling me that there is no hope. But we've prayed for that person, and that person is well, that she's been cured. And medicine is sort of like that. You do have knowledge, but at the end of the day, when you're giving someone a treatment, you're still hanging on hope that it's going to work, because it doesn't work 100% of the time. So there has to be room for not being able to explain everything to a T. That's how I would approach it.
Yeah, that's really good. Now, you said you had this kind of change and you became a wound care specialist. Do you like it? Do you feel like you made the right decision?
Yes, I think it's providence where God redirected my career. I think there's a spiritual aspect that I'm seeing now on wounds. I take care of wounds that don't heal. So it's normally, I get referrals from doctors who've tried to heal a wound, but they don't heal in conventional methods. And I feel like there's a sort of like a metaphor spiritually on that aspect, that we do carry wounds in our lives that sometimes because it hasn't healed, we tend to ignore, but God has an answer to every wound that we have. And I think for me as a wound care doctor, even the treatments that I give my patients, I feel like there's always like I can always relate it to something spiritual. Most of my patients are in the geriatric population. They're normally not there mentally anymore. It's great to be able to physically help them, but also minister to them spiritually. I've had patients that I've been able to pray for, patients who are in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. They tend to be depressed and feel lonely, especially at that stage of their lives. And just to be able to speak an encouragement, speak a word of life to them is very satisfying to me.
So you're ministering to the whole person.
Yes.
Not just.
Yeah, I try to. Growing up, matriculating in a Western medicine, they don't teach you that, but I've had 10 years of medical experience at this point, and I know that treating illnesses, whether it's young or old, it's not just a physical aspect to it. Most of the time, if the patient keeps on coming back for the same thing and all the stuff that you've given them doesn't work, there's usually something else.
Really?
Yeah.
Like a spiritual problem?
Yes. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. And I think just being a Christian, having that arsenal on you is it's very good as a physician, because you're not intimidated by big things. As a doctor also, I'm able to acknowledge my limitations as a person, as a human being, that I can make mistakes. That my knowledge, however vast it is still limited to what's happening in that person's body. Being able to pray for them and ask for spiritual healing has been great.
Well, now, what kind of challenges do you go through in your life right now? Like, are they just with your practice? Is it with other things you're interested in? What else is going on in your life?
I think the main challenge, this sort of happens in my life, is just overcoming discouragements. I'm a person who's very introverted. I try to think about things. I actually don't try. It just happens. I have thoughts recurring in my head, and just, most of them are negative thoughts. I wouldn't necessarily say that all of them is spiritual in nature. I feel like it's more my insecurities rising up. And the main challenge is just recognizing what's me or what's something else versus what's really God. And
how do you do that?
Just delving in the Word. Being familiar with God's truths. The most effective way, and I've started doing that only just a few years back, is just writing down God's faithfulness in my life. So I have a list that I can go to and say, God has been faithful in this aspect of my life.
I've heard people say that you need like little signposts so that when you go through something hard now, you can remember, yes, but remember how hard when I went through such and such, and God came through. And if you can just keep reminding yourself of those, then it helps you have faith for right now. Right?
Yes, definitely. So I have a journal that has all of God's victories in my life, both like financial, physical, and even just spiritual victories, being delivered from rejection, all of that stuff, the stuff from my childhood and all of that, and just looking back and seeing God's faithfulness. It didn't have anything to do with how hard I tried to solve those things. It was really just God's hand. When I'm still in the process of getting my permanent residency in the U.S. And whenever I get anxious about it, I always just look back to the time when I was in the Philippines. I had no clue how I'm going to come back, and just go back and say, you know what, God has brought me back here. And if he was able to do that under overwhelming circumstances, the green card would be a piece of cake for him.
So you don't even, and so by doing that, past faith helps you have new faith.
Oh yes, definitely.
Right. Have you ever noticed that it's like, yeah, God, I know you did it before, but can you do it now? Because this seems harder.
Yes.
And that's when you do need to remind yourself of those, and remember how hard it was and how impossible, right?
Right.
Well, now, do you do anything else besides medicine? Is that all you do in your life? Do you have other things going on?
I like hiking. I'm outdoorsy. I'm trying to run long distance. So this year I signed up for the New York Marathon. At church, I also serve as our technical director for our service. So I do a lot of backstage production stuff, setting up for the service and all of that. Aside from that, I do lead a small group. So aside
now,
from
what's a small group?
Oh, okay. It's basically get together. Some people call it a Bible study, but most of my small group members are Filipino, so it's our excuse to just come together and eat on a Friday night.
And Filipino food is good.
It's great, yes. And we try not to be comatose after the eating, but so it's just coming together. Again, it's an avenue where we can. It's a community where we can repeat God's goodness in our life for that week or that month.
And pray for each other.
Correct, right? And then it's also an avenue for people to, because living in New York is very hard, even for a doctor, even for anyone, it's hard. Whether you're single, where you have kids, and whether you have money or you don't have, there's always a lot of challenges. And it's just sanctuary for these people to be able to come and get rest from the daily worries and have people to support them and pray for them.
I heard someone say recently that you cannot really make it as a Christian all by yourself, and that the people who say, well, I don't go to church, but I'm a spiritual person. And this man said, I bet that you do not have the walk with God that God wants you to have, because you have to have community. The Bible talks about its hands and feet and toes, and it takes everybody to build up and make the body of Christ. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think if there was one thing, if I could go back to when I initially moved to New York, I would make it a point to really surround myself with a good Christian community.
How do you find it?
Going to your local church is one. If you don't have a local church, there's technology now. You can Google it. Other things is, join a small group. I think in New York, there's so many churches that you can join now.
There's a lot of good churches here.
I think that because there's so much, people tend to church hop is what they call it, and they don't really build community with that. So the word of advice that I can tell those people is that they need to stick it out with whatever Christian community they're in. People are people, they're flawed people, so they're going to disappoint you at some point, but there has to be something about sticking with a group or something, and just being able to weather whatever it is in that relationship will help even build your trust and your relationship with them.
Yeah, well, Jaymi, do you ever have people in the medical field come and ask you questions about God?
I do. I used to work for a medical group, and my boss is Christian and his wife is Christian. They're both doctors. So we were actually encouraged to pray for our patients. Sometimes
that's kind of unusual, isn't it?
It's very unusual. So I felt like that was that helped me be comfortable in doing that in my medical field, because obviously it's not encouraged. They want you to be they just want you to treat the patient as a doctor. So that helped me be comfortable in just asking the patient if they want a prayer. And then slowly, because you have a reputation of, oh, this doctor prays for me, there are some patients who actually don't have medical problems, but come to the office because they're going through something and they need a prayer.
Is that right?
Yes,
And so they know Dr. Jaymi. Do they call you Dr. Cheng or do they call you Dr. Jaymi?
I prefer Dr. Cheng, but then you can call me Dr. Jaymi or So
sure.
It's that blesses my heart when they come and know that we're not just there to give drugs or like take care of them physically, but that we also care for them as a person, as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and probably older people feel that need if their members of their family are gone or they're away from members of their family. They probably need you more than ever, right?
Yeah. In the nursing homes, it is pretty lonely. There are patients that don't ever get visited by their family members or their family members are out of state. So those people, I take like special care of them and try to see what other things that we can do for them.
About how many patients do you watch over? Like in your practice, how many are you kind of having to take care of?
I don't even know. Probably around 400.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's a combination. So I work for 2 practices right now. The wound care, we service about 9 nursing homes. There's about 20 to 30 patients per nursing home, and then the other practice has outpatient.
Well, I tell you, Jaymi, this has been a really good interview. I think people watching this have learned a lot, and I want you to think about what you've heard her say. She has discovered that she can actually have a personal walk with God, a personal walk with Jesus, and at the same time be a highly intelligent physician. So she says there's no problem between science and God that some people struggle with. I want you to think about something. Where are you with God tonight? It wasn't an accident that you turned in and turned on the TV. I hope you got some wisdom and that you have a great rest of the night, whether you're going to sleep or going to work. I'll see you next time. Bye.